What is the worst thing you've ever seen someone do at a funeral? The gentleman had a large family and all of his siblings got up and made it all about themselves. Dredged up old family drama. Made it clear that they resented his wife, etc. It was so painfully awkward. I had a fit of hysterical laugh at my father's funeral just about the time people started to gather at the mortuary. In my defense, my mother had a nervous breakdown. My father died 4 days after we found out he had lung cancer. There was a lot of shitty stuff surrounding the funeral organization. My mom just flipped. My siblings were 15 and lost, so I was at 23 left to handle it all. I kinda lost it. One of my students' mother died. I went to the funeral with the principal and the student's integration aide. After the funeral, her father walked up to her and her grandmother and said, "I want her out of the house by tomorrow morning." She was 11 years old. Her ex told us about all the great things she did in bed and what a loss for mankind that is. He handed out his business cards at his stepdaughter's funeral. There was very nearly a fist fight. Dwight. Good morning. Dwight Scroot. Thank you all for your prayers and your remembrances. Like Justin and his disfigurement, I too have had a horrible year. They say that the middle class is disappearing. And with it, the soul of America. So, as a gift to this beautiful congregation, I would like to offer a 4% discount on all Dunder Mifflin Sabre products if you buy a printer at full price. Semicolon. Edit. Thank you Anonymous Redditor for the award. It felt like cheating the system of being awarded for literally copying or pasting a quote. It seems like for many instances we face in life, The Office always has a reference. Not a funeral, but when my granddad passed and we went to view his body at the crematorium, my aunt started stealing from the facility the second the employee's back was turned. Just shoving anything that wasn't nailed down into her purse and pockets. Unbelievable. And yes, we called her out and made her put it all back. Nowhere near as bad as most comments, but the family didn't allow for his twin to speak. Straight up skipped over the allocated time for the living twin to get up and speak about his brother, who was his last remaining immediate family. I don't think I can ever forgive the late wife for putting him through that. She treated him so horribly all throughout the sickness. And then to not allow him to be a part of the funeral was the final nail in the coffin. Edit. I didn't think this would resonate with people and I'm truly shocked. Please consider making a donation to your local cancer research foundation. Or donating stem cells. Cancer sucks. A few years back, when the uncle of my mother died, my young cousin, 8, cried a lot at the funeral. It took some time, but eventually he calmed down and his parents went for a little walk with him for some distraction. But then he noticed that his first name was written on one of the tombstones. He mentions it loudly and one of the bystanders said, "Yeah, it's already reserved for you." He immediately started crying again. My uncle was pissed about something in my grandmother's will. So during the funeral, he went out to the parking lot and keyed everyone's car. It should be noted, he has severe brain injury from a motorcycle accident that causes him to be constantly angry and paranoid. Still, my husband went to his great aunt's funeral, and while they did the little ceremony in the cemetery, great aunt's granddaughters were all hiding behind a tombstone giggling and doing coke. Edit. My brother-in-law is a mortician. Boy does he have stories. One of the best, a guy disguised himself as a nun. Shows up at the funeral. Pulls a gun from under his habit and tries to shoot the deceased's son. Luckily the gun malfunctioned and didn't fire. The son then decks the nun and knocks him out. Kicks him in the head a few times. And is pulled off by other family. Police are called. Yada yada yada. Turns out the deceased owed the nun quite a lot of money and the son had refused to honor the debt. Don't start nun won't be none. At my father's funeral, one of my aunts asked my mom when would she get out of the house. My aunt crawled into her father's open casket. I knew a guy who climbed up into the casket with his grandfather. This one sweet and wholesome. He was around 4 years old. He wasn't sure what was going on. and people weren't giving him much attention. He asked someone what his grandfather was doing in a box at the front of the room. A relative, thinking they were explaining death in an age-appropriate way, told him that grandpa went to sleep and won't wake up again. So we went up to the casket and climbed up. The room froze in shock. Then he said, "Good night, Grandpa," and he kissed him. Adults told him later you could hear a pin drop and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. My sister murdered her father, my stepfather. My nan told my dad at his own father's funeral that her pain was much greater because she had lost a husband, while he had only lost his dad. As if grief is a competition. She is a shitty person anyway. And not even blood related to us, so we just kinda don't associate anymore. Edit. She called my dad last night, claiming that she and my granddad had a baby in 1999 and the baby died when it was 5. But she's full of shitty. My grandpa died. His son, my uncle, went around asking for money to give to his now widowed mother. He collected around $500 worth of donations from family, friends, etc. He pocketed it. Not seen but experienced. My cousin's wife was kicking the back of my chair at my granddad's funeral. Also carrying on a conversation with my sister, who was supposedly really sad the whole way through the service. For context, I was 14 and my cousin's wife was in her mid to late 30s. My mother-in-law took a photo of a wine glass during the lunch we had after, and she posted it on Facebook. Guess what her caption was? "Life is grand." It was my mother's funeral. At my grandfather's funeral, one of the choir members essentially threw a tantrum and ended up interrupting one of my uncles who was giving a speech just because she wasn't given any food. The thing is, there wasn't any food at the funeral to begin with. My uncle died and at his funeral my cousin, his son, was crying. Some old timer uncle came up to him and said, "Stop crying, you're a man, you're embarrassing us." I never wanted to slap someone at a funeral more than at that moment. My minister once told a story. He was waiting in a room of the sanctuary before the funeral when he heard scuffling noises. When he went to investigate, the brother and sister of the deceased had pulled the body out of the casket and propped it between them. They explained that they didn't have a recent photo of the three of them and were delighted he showed up to take the picture. My uncle was cremated. He lived across from a lake and it was decided that we wanted his ashes spread on this little island on this lake. I was tasked with swimming with the urn from the boat to the island, holding it out of the water. I then stood at the edge of a small cliff with my nephews beside me and all the family watching in the boat. I opened the urn to dump his ashes over the cliff. We all say a few things, and as I go to dump the ashes, the wind picks up and blows the ashes all over my wet body. One of the worst things that ever happened to me. My grandsister died recently and they were holding a service at my aunt's house before the burial. My gran, closing in on 90, deaf as a post and suffering from vascular dementia, lost patience with the celebrant as she was about halfway through the reading and loudly announces, "Oh, will she know, just bloody shut up," at the top of her voice. My poor mum was completely mortified, although the rest of the family was very understanding. Luckily, no one returned the favor at my grand service the following year. After the eulogist had talked for 45 minutes, the pastor went over to the lectern and politely asked him to conclude his eulogy. The guy boldly told the pastor, "I'll stop when I'm damn good and ready," and proceeded talking for about 20 more minutes. Close bracket. The total funeral church service lasted for 3/4 hours. It seemed endless. A friend of the family with a notorious drinking problem showed up to the visitation and service extremely intoxicated. She is not a sad drunk. She is a happy, huggy drunk, so she went around sloppily hugging everyone, even people she didn't know. She slurred introductions and condolences to everyone for about an hour, then tripped over a settee in one of the sitting rooms of the funeral home and face planted. My cousin died at 14 years old from taking a dodgy ecstasy pill at a party. At her funeral, another cousin's boyfriend then proceeded to try and sell drugs. At her funeral, last I heard, her dad found him and he and his friends kicked the guy's teeth in. Selfie with the corpse. Corpsey. Not at a funeral but at my auntie's wake. A dude approached my little sister and hit on her. She was 12 years old. The officiant moved the partner of the deceased back a couple of rows because they weren't family. At least that was their initial reasoning. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the partner being same-sex. I was furious. And then it got worse. The officiant decided to make the entire funeral about mental health and how everyone should get help. Nothing about the life of the loved one. No celebration of their accomplishments, of the beauty they brought to the world. Nothing. Keep in mind that 80% of the congregation still believed the death was because of physical health reasons. We would have coped with the knowledge. But telling us it was suicide only as a platform for the rest of us to seek help was heartbreaking. Only funeral I've ever rung and complained about. Die. It's like proposing at someone else's wedding. Just rude. At my dad's funeral, one of his old bandmates, from about 15 years ago at the time, promoted his new band. It was at the part where people go up to the mic and say some kind words, speeches, etc. My dad killed himself and some dude used it as a marketing opportunity. There was also a pastor there who was playing hymns. My dad was an atheist. My dad was also dead for over a week. His side of the family decided to have an open casket. Still had rope marks around his neck. There was the stench of decomposition that filled the room. Ugh. Priest called the deceased full of sin and refused one of his final requests that his dog's ashes be buried with him. His son didn't care and snuck in his dog's ashes with his anyways. My mom passed 2 days before my first child was born. I didn't get pregnant again till 11 years later, so I was 5 months pregnant with my second child when my father passed. Someone came up to me at the funeral and said to me, "You should stop having kids." I went to the funeral of a co-worker's fiancé. The girl's ex showed up and as people were lined up to say goodbye, we all witnessed him lean into the coffin and kiss her on the lips. I will repeat myself. The ex-boyfriend of the deceased woman kissed her dead body at her funeral. In front of her fiancé. Her brothers quite literally threw him out. 2 different situations. 1. When I was 10 at my grandpa's funeral. A relative told me I was lucky for being so young because now I'll never miss my grandpa. 2. At my grandma's funeral. Her neighbor asked us if he could stop by the house that day and take some stuff off of our hands. No offer of money. Just wanted free stuff. Someone's kid thought it'd be funny to give the corpse a wet willy. The kid was like 7 and I'm almost positive didn't even know the deceased. Good. When my grandma died in the early 80s. Kids were running up, touching her body, and running away laughing. My mom was furious and went around telling the parents. A local boy died after being hit by a car while riding his bike. I think he was like 11/12 at the time. His sister, known to all to be very attention seeking, immediately was doing news interviews, which just seemed odd, considering he had died earlier that day. But whatever. People grieve differently, I suppose. But then at his wake, she took a few photos of him in the casket and posted it to her public Instagram story. It was super bizarre and just bad taste. Watched my cousin's abusive, now ex-husband demand that his son not cry or show emotion at his grandmother's, my aunt, funeral or else he would call him weak. Luckily, my dad was there and told him otherwise. The guy only showed up to the funeral anyway because he was constantly hounding my cousin about how much money my aunt had left her. They stole the envelope of money. My grandpa called my mom fat at a funeral she planned for his dead wife. The granddaughter of the deceased started a fire in the church bathroom during the funeral. No idea why she did it. She wasn't mentally well, though. And her grandmother's death really messed her up. Luckily it was put out pretty quickly and didn't cause much damage. Odd thing was that it was the men's room and not the women's. Got a couple stories. A shitty one and a funny one. All names are fake. Shitty one. Husband's mate James died by suicide. Their friendship group, all knew each other from secondary school, came for the funeral. At the wake and the pub after, Susan said there's a James-shaped hole in our lives. We all nod. She adds there's a Lucas-shaped hole in our lives too. Lucas was exiled from the group after pleading guilty to downloading 100k plus child abuse images. Many in the worst category. As well as a how to find a victim manual. The fact that she dared to compare these two men filled us with disgust. Susan has been exiled as well. Funny one. Husband's mate works part-time in his dad's funeral director business. He was working one day at a burial and dropped the hearse keys into the freshly dug, coffinless grave. And the brother of the deceased had to fetch a stick to retrieve them. Luckily all present had a good laugh about it. My uncle passed and the priest was new in town. Young and nervous as hell. He got stuck in a loop. You could tell he was trying to break out of it but instead kept repeating the phrase in different and more horrible ways. He may be in heaven with the Lord but his wife, aunt's name, is still on earth with us. She is alone and needs our comfort. When we go home tonight we have friends and family but she'll be in an empty house. She'll wake up to an empty house in an empty bed. She'll be alone from now on and we need to remember to invite her to things because she's alone. At one point one of my other aunts huffed loudly to get him to stop. It didn't work. He ran himself into the ground telling us how empty and alone she is now that her husband is dead. My uncle relentlessly flirted with a funeral home employee. While at his dad's funeral. She was obviously deeply uncomfortable and he was so narcissistic he thought she was interested. This is a story my father told me from when he was a child in the 1940s. There was a named church beside the farm where he grew up in rural SC. The church had no electricity. There was a funeral there one evening and the church was lit throughout with candles. The church building had existed since just after emancipation and was in really bad shape. The flooring had been severely damaged by termites. During the funeral, the floor gave way making the casket tumble and the body fall out. Everyone ran out of the church in terror. Making matters worse, the candles that were on the casket fell to the floor and set the church on fire. The whole community watched outside as it burned to the ground. This is how I want my funeral to go. Epic and mildly traumatizing. Show up really. The Baptist preacher at my grandma's funeral tried to convert my Jewish family. Mom converted to marry my dad. Brother and I were raised Jewish. Said very pointedly that non-Christian family won't be able to reunite with her in heaven and other hurtful things directed at us. My grandma was very open and accepting of my mom's faith change. But this preacher was a total douche. Wrong place and time to try that. Funerals where I'm from involves a lot of drinking, singing, and sometimes even gambling. I don't think there's a year where we never hear a news about someone getting severely beaten or a brawl breaking out at a funeral. I've only witnessed it once though. My story isn't as heinous as some of these. But when my wife's grandmother passed a few years back, we arrived at the cemetery with the funeral procession. And they hadn't even dug the hole yet. They did the entire graveside ceremony thing with a casket sitting on a gurney in the grass. All the while, there's a guy waiting in a backhoe just up the hill. It all seemed so strangely, I don't know, unprofessional. My uncle died. He was gay. My grandmother couldn't handle that. My uncle left a letter to be read at his funeral. I don't know if my grandmother planned it all alone or what. But gets to the part that says, "And to my nieces and nephews, I want you to know." And instead of reading what was there, I know cause me and my dad helped my uncle write it. She went on this huge, insane tangent with tons of swearing about how none of us should be like him, commit his sins, etc. That he died of AIDS as a punishment. That was the most homophobic and hateful few minutes I can ever remember hearing. It was so disrespectful to everyone. And so terrible. She was an ugly person.